Peter Dutton, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Sharri.
You first called for a national cabinet in November 2023. It's now more than a year later and we've seen a childcare centre firebombed overnight. The Prime Minister finally listened to your demand today. In your view, is Albanese and his government partly to blame for the escalating violence that we've seen?
Sharri, there's no doubt in my mind whatsoever, and I think it was entirely predictable the last 12, 14 months because of what we saw on the steps of the Opera House. And when you saw the depth of hatred, and we have all known, of course, that anti-Semitism is lurking just beneath the surface, but I think it was given a face and we saw the depth of some of it on the steps of the Opera House, and that was the trigger, I thought, for the Prime Minister to have what I've described as sort of the Port Arthur moment that John Howard had, to take a terrible circumstance and show the leadership that the nation required. And I think you could reasonably predict what has happened over the course of the last 12 months that is continuing to escalate. But the Prime Minister seems to have either not acknowledged that, not comprehended it, or has just been out of his depth in terms of trying to deal with an issue. And I think the National Cabinet coming together with a meaningful agenda, with action items, it would have sent a clear message from the Prime Minister and the Premiers and Chief Ministers to the police ministers and to the police commissioners across the jurisdictions and at a Commonwealth level that we have zero tolerance for the anti-Semitism, the actions on the university campuses, etc., that were allowed to continue on had there been a National Cabinet where it had been determined and agreement had been arrived at that the states weren't going to allow that sort of hateful conduct. Then we wouldn't have seen the escalation, in my judgment, and people would have known that there's a consequence for their actions.
At the moment, every night you go to sleep and you worry what the night holds, what's going to unfold, which institution or home is going to be attacked next. You wake up in the morning terrified at what's happened overnight, scared to look at the news. How can we live like this in this country?
I can't understand the amount of inaction that we've seen from the government in Victoria. The Premier there has just been as weak, frankly, as the Prime Minister. And I think what makes it most egregious is that people are living with that fear, not because the Prime Minister has some greater national security cause in mind, or it's a piece on a chessboard that he's had to play because of the geopolitical circumstances in the region of the world. He's done it for crass political reasons, which I think makes it even more offensive to people, because he's decided to support one segment of the our society and to essentially shun another part of society. I just haven't seen a Prime Minister do that before. And I think you're right, there are a lot of Australians who are living with the fear that their house is going to be broken into and keys are going to be stolen to take the car, and so people are leaving their keys, by the front door or in the kitchen in plain sight. And it's just a small example of what the entire Jewish community is living with at the moment, because they're worried that they're going to be targeted not because of their car but because of their religion, or because of the fact that they've got Jewish heritage, and many of whom I was talking to a couple yesterday who've been here 60 years, living peacefully in a suburb, and they're the subject of one of these arson attacks. I mean, it's just appalling.
I think I know the couple you mean, and the 85-year-old man went out in his pyjamas at 4 a.m. and holding a hose had to try put out the flames of the torched car.
Yes.
85. Yeah. Holding the hose at 4 in the morning. It's unfathomable that this is what Sydney, Australia has come to.
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I think we have to have zero tolerance. We've made announcements in relation to strengthening of the laws that we think would provide a very significant deterrence around mandatory sentencing, and if we can do that, then I think we have a much better chance of stamping out the anti-Semitism that's now rife in our country.
So the National Cabinet is meeting almost as we speak. They aren't considering the mandatory sentences that you've put on the table, that you as a police officer think would work as a deterrent to criminals looking at taking this sort of violent action. Why do you think mandatory sentences are important. I spoke with Chris Minns earlier, and he said that those sort of laws were reserved for the most heinous crimes like murdering a policeman.
Well, what about murdering an Australian because of their religious affiliation, or murdering an Australian because their grandparents were have migrated from Israel or were in the Holocaust? I mean, so I don't understand his point. Every Australian life is sacrosanct, and we're talking about terrorist attacks now. This is not a random break and enter into a house to steal money to buy food or buy drugs. People are being targeted.
This is a wave of terror, domestic terror.
These are terrorist acts, and if there were a series of rolling terrorist attacks in the community, I think the Prime Minister would call a National Cabinet and a National Security Committee meeting in a heartbeat. And yet it's taken him 15 months to get to this point, 14 months to get to this point, and he does it without any fanfare, or he had a press conference with the Premier this morning, made no mention of it, and holds it this afternoon, I think, just to tick the box to
like
say
an
that he's done
afterthought.
it. Exactly. The National Cabinet meeting should be an opportunity to bring premiers and the police ministers together, as well as the police commissioners and the security agencies, to say this is a national crisis, and what we're dealing with now is a national crisis. And how do we respond most adequately to it? Well, we think the laws are inadequate as they currently stand, which has been said before by some of the Labor politicians. If that's their view, then bring an amendment to the Act and we'll support it through Parliament in the next fortnight. So unless there is a substantive package that we're not aware of, and I hope that there is, that's being considered by the National Cabinet, this is really just a media management exercise by the Prime Minister, and won't provide any comfort or any assurance that we could see a better response to the anti-Semitism that is up by 700% across the country.
And that's just reported incidents, so it would be worse than that.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. As Prime Minister of the country, there is an incredible responsibility to set the tone. There is serious leadership required. You know, we often speak about the importance of rhetoric, and the Prime Minister in one breath is criticising Israel. In the next breath, he's calling for calm on that very issue on our streets. Isn't this a hypocritical message to send? And his own criticisms, and that of Penny Wong's and Tony Burke's and Ed Husick's, and the list goes on, haven't they in part emboldened the aggression we're seeing and almost given a green light to people to feel that way?
Yes, and look, that may not be their intention, but that's the consequence of their actions and their words. The Prime Minister of our country has made a deliberate decision to abandon people of the Jewish community because he sees political advantage in doing so. That's what's happened here. He's taken a decision to try and win over Green voters. We now know that the Greens political party is an anti-Semitic racist party led by Adam Band, and that has been a dramatic escalation and perhaps they've just drawn back the veil of who they always were in the Greens. But the Prime Minister, in his mind, is in a contest with the Greens to hold seats like his own of Grayndler, like Sydney, to win seats or hold seats in Western Sydney. And he has made a deliberate decision to chase those votes by his inaction and his walking both sides of the street in relation to anti-Semitism. And I think it's shameful conduct, and I think history will record the Prime Minister's role in this whole debate in a very, very poor way.
Agreed. On Susan Lyons, look, she was down in formal documentation from Home Affairs to lead the delegation to the 80th liberation of Auschwitz next week. The Albanese government's now trying to back away from this publicly, say that a cabinet minister will go. They can't say who. What do you think of the decision to send her, given the calibre of other people who are going? King Charles is going, for example.
Well, if it wasn't such a serious issue, it would be comical. It really would. I mean, there's no explanation whatsoever. I don't know what's going on in the Prime Minister's office. I think the government has lost control of many of these debates, the cost of living debate, the energy debate, and certainly social cohesion and the law and order debate in our country at the moment, the anti-Semitism debate. And to think that they could send somebody of with the background of Sue Lyons that nobody's ever heard of, and that somehow that is showing respect and is an opportunity taken to try and mend the relationship with Israel, which the Prime Minister says there's no problem with the relationship, which of course is just a fabrication. Again, is beyond understanding. I couldn't. I mean, you could think of Penny Wong, you could think of Tony Burke, of Anthony Albanese, but Sue Lyons possibly, I mean, is at least as bad as all of them, if not worse, in terms of who you could think could represent our country at such a significant event.
Highly offensive.
It is.
Yeah. Donald Trump's inauguration obviously has just happened. Do you think if you were to lead the next Australian government, you would have a better relationship with President Trump rather than the Albanese government?
Look, there's no doubt in my mind. I think the philosophical differences between the Prime Minister and President Trump are obvious. The Prime Minister found comfort in his relationship with Jacinda Ardern and Justin Trudeau and other left-leaning leaders around the world. That's the reflection of just on the Prime Minister's life and his outlook. He's been the leader of the hard left of the Labor Party for decades. What does he have in common with Donald Trump? What common ground could they find in relation to key issues? It's hard to imagine much at all. So there's no doubt in my mind that we can have a very effective relationship and a productive relationship and a respectful relationship mutually. With the Trump administration, in a government that I lead, we have people of the calibre of James Patterson, who has very good relationships with key individuals within the Trump administration, similarly with Andrew Hastie, Angus Taylor, myself, and I dealt with the Trump administration Mark I with the Trump 45 administration. So I feel very confident in the relationship that we could quickly build, and I think it would be to our country's benefit that we're able to leverage off that.
You dealt with the administration on national security matters, of course.
Yeah.
I'm Peter Dutton, looking at how you might strengthen national security. You were Home Affairs Minister while Donald Trump was President the last time. The agency was one of the most formidable in the Australian government. That has now been dismantled under Albanese. You've got Tony Burke as the minister, which is almost a joke. Would you return Home Affairs to its former strength? We
would, and not for any ideological reason. We knew out of the 9/11 attacks that part of the reason that those attacks took place was that the agencies were working in silos, and the agencies needed to come together to share intelligence to prevent another attack. And we, when we formed Home Affairs, had in mind that we wanted ASIO to have a better relationship with the AFP, with the Australian Border Force, with the Australian Criminal Intelligence Commission. And by bringing all of those agencies together in Home Affairs, we stopped terrorist attacks from taking place. I think we're a less safe country now. And you ask yourself the question, well, why would the Albanese government have pulled apart Home Affairs? Well, firstly, they don't understand national security. That much is obvious. They always take money out of the agencies. And if we are serious about stopping these terrorist attacks on synagogues and on childcare centres and at people's homes, etc., then I think the coordination role that Home Affairs plays, and not just with the federal agencies but with the state agencies as well, we would give ourselves the best chance of defeating the scourge of terrorism that's present in our country right now if Home Affairs was to be brought back to life.
Trump has announced a range of executive orders, including that there's only two genders, a man and a woman. He also has pledged to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord. Does it seem to you that the age of woke ideology is now coming to an end, and there's this sense globally that people have just had enough?
I think there is, and I think particularly when people are struggling to pay their bills, they can't pay their mortgage, their insurance has gone up, their grocery bill's gone up, they just see a government with the wrong priorities. And I think people are sick of being ostracised and sick of being vilified, and I think the Voice in our country, to be honest, allowed people an opportunity to be able to speak again about issues that they felt important to what, including Australia Day, which I think is an important debate for our country to have. We're not going to have reconciliation when we have people living under three different flags. We have one national flag, and that's incredibly important. So I think there is everything in life's a cycle, but I think this is turning, and I think there is going to be a near revolution that comes with the Trump administration in relation to a lot of the woke issues that might be fashionable in universities and at the ABC, but that just aren't cutting it around kitchen tables at the moment, where people can't pay their bills under the Albanese cost of living crisis.
Do you think some of those issues Australians here also are frustrated by, that Trump spoke about today?
Yeah, no question. And I think those debates will continue here in our country as well. I think on energy the debate has shifted quite significantly, because the pennies dropped that the renewables only policy is just going to keep driving your cost of electricity up, and that we're going to have blackouts and brownouts, and the fact that manufacturing businesses have closed, threefold in number over the last 2.5 years, and people want a sensible, common sense outcome and approach by their leaders, and as opposed to the path that the Prime Minister's had us on.
Would you consider withdrawing from Paris?
I think we've been pretty firm in our commitment to net zero by 2050, and that's a commitment that we take seriously and that we'll honour. I think it'll be interesting to see where the United States goes and what influence that has in Europe and elsewhere around the world over the course of the next couple of years. I think the defence space is an interesting one. I think in the first administration, President Trump was able to leverage NATO partners into extra funding in their own budgets for defence. And so, I mean, the President has moved markets even before his inauguration, which is quite phenomenal. And obviously with his executive orders today, he's sent a very clear intent. And I think the lessons of the first term will have been learnt, and it will make a much more definite approach in this term. And I think the President has a very clear perspective on what he wants to do in relation to many of these issues, climate included. And yeah, I think some of those debates obviously naturally will unfold here as they will across the world.
All right, Peter Dutton, really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Sharri.
Thank you
very
so much.
My
Thank
pleasure.
you.
Thank you.